So in this video we're going to look at a couple of poems that we think are particularly political. They focus on religion primarily, but actually that can be examined as a more generally political stance that Blake is taking. If we look at some of those political protest themes and approaches, we can see that the texts are both going to be in this kind of lyrical but a sort of persona poem as well, and both of them create a character. One poem is very much in the voice of the character throughout, and the other partially. Settings are churches and also alehouses. There's definitely a kind of power struggle, and it's between the individual and institutions as much as it is between a child and church figures of authority and parental authority too. That idea of pursuit of power and rebellion isn't obvious here, except that it is an individual rebelling against the kind of institutional authority. The human organisations here are churches, but the implication is that any kind of authoritarian approach to life can and should be challenged. So again, some of those key terms that we always look out to try and use in our essays. There's definitely elements of suppression here, resistance, control, radical voices, certainly. Very much the poems are about radical voices, voices daring to say the heretical, the unacceptable. There's cruelty and punishment in these poems, and authority figures, certainly. As we look at methodologies, it's about creating a voice. Both poems are going to be about that, and we'll see, as ever, Blake uses lyrical typical features of lyrics with rhyme and a clear stanza structure. And we're going to try to pursue some of those key themes that have appeared on the questions before. So there's certainly stories here about constraint. Parents are implied in both poems, although not necessarily the main focus. Religion and the misery that it brings is the focus of both poems to some extent. And that human spirit resisting, again, very much both poems about that. And authoritative figures being unkind. The idea of innocence leading to joy, again, these poems, like most of the experience poems, challenge that notion. If we start with The Little Vagabond, this is written in the voice of a child, so it seems, and parents are mentioned at the beginning there, so that parental power relationship is part of the theme of the poem. And the child seems to be loving towards the parent, but seems to be protesting against being taken to church, which is physically cold, but also kind of spiritually and emotionally cold. Great line, I know, I can tell where I am used well, the third line there. The child, again, is not as innocent as we might assume. It is an experienced poem. Children know more than perhaps some authority figures, parental figures, and institutional figures give them credit for. He knows instinctively that the church does not treat him with the respect that he feels he wants and deserves. And such usage in heaven will never do well. He sees God and Jesus and the angels on his side, and that these figures of oppression, which is basically what the poem is about, these oppressive, puritanical figures really in the church who want to control and constrain everybody into behaving in a very limited way and not taking any delight in any aspect of life. These people don't chime with what Blake sees as God or Christ's or the angel's will. And so he offers this very heretical idea that we should, treat the church more like a pub. You should get some booze when you go there. And that it gives us an image of perhaps a more contemporary church, what's sometimes called the happy clappy type of church, where there's a lot of song and a lot of joy. And so in some ways Blake is sort of predicting a kind of Protestantism that does emerge a bit later. There were many Protestant sects at this time, and some were starting to celebrate more, and others were being more puritanical and more strict about what they considered to be moral behaviour. He says that if they could change their ways in church, then the pastor and the priest could be drinking and singing at the same time, and we'd be as happy as birds in the spring. Typical connection of children and birds and sweet, small, cute animals. Modest Dame Lurch is a key figure. She, I think, is the idea of a sort of puritanical parent. Lurch suggesting a sort of lumbering, almost monster-like, unpleasant, blank, dull dreariness. And her children are bandy, meaning that they have rickets, presumably, and therefore are not well nourished. So she's poor, although she seems to favour fasting, as in not eating as part of a religious observance. And the birch is the stick that she would beat her children with. So she is the puritanical authority figure towards children in this case, who says that, I'm going to make you live a very limited and controlled life, and I'm going to enforce my authority through violence. The outcome of this is the child says in his innocence, and this Blake could say, well, it's only a child speaking, it's not me, so we can leave that layer of irony there, that God would see this happiness in the church when we abandon the sort of strict religion, start drinking and singing, and he would make up with the devil and start to drink with him and kiss him even, which is quite extreme. So the idea here is that the God and the devil could unite, the good and evil could be brought together. It's a very kind of, again, heretical idea. In terms of our methods, well, the rhyme is there all the way through. Some of the rhymes are very clear, others a little bit more forced, but most of them pretty what we call good rhymes. It doesn't rhyme in the first two lines there, and then the second two in the first stanza just repeat, but and then again in the second stanza there's the rhyme starts to come in there with ale and regale and day and stray, slightly off but only just with the sort of single syllable to double. Third stanza is much more clearly rhymed, although church and birch are a sound rhyme, not a sight rhyme. He and see and barrel and apparel are good rhymes. So what words come out of that? Church birch is a good rhyme, isn't it? The church is like a sort of force of cruelty. And interestingly, stray day as well. That this is a kind of poem about straying from the orthodox. And at the end there, barrel and apparel is hard to see that that's not kind of a bit of a forced rhyme. But Blake might say that it was an inspiration. Couldn't think of anything else to rhyme with barrel other than apparel. But then out of that comes an interesting idea about clothing the devil. I'm not sure exactly what the implications of that are. There's the classic simile there as happy as birds. That's a very Blakean symbol of joy and freedom, which we see in the schoolboy, for instance. So it's often linked to children who are like birds in one way or another, other cute and adorable animals and creatures. In terms of our exam questions, here is somebody definitely trying to escape from constraint, but struggling with that, not seeming necessarily to find that easy to convince his audience. The oppressive parents of Dame Lurch in particular, but also the mother who takes him to this cold church. Religion is certainly about misery, not joy here, and that's his point. That's the point of this poem. So this would have been absolutely perfect for that question, that this is a poem in which an innocent child sees the truth that adults can't, that religion should surely be about joy. God surely wants us to be happy. God surely created this world for us to be happy and not to be miserable in, but some people don't seem to see that. The human spirit has power to resist. This is all about that, isn't it? Saying there is a human spirit that is joyous and rebellious too. The no hope for the marginalised is less obvious here. That this does seem to offer a kind of hope, but it's quite a naive hope. Personal relationships are liberating and empowering. I'm not sure I'd use this one for that question, although you could look at the parental relationships here. Authority is unkind and shows no compassion. Definitely Dame Lurch is that. The church in general as an authority seems lacking in compassion and care. And innocence leads to joy and happiness. Well, kind of yes, in a way, that this joyful perspective on how the world could be comes from this innocent, childlike view. And as such, if only we could allow that childlike view to prevail, we could perhaps live a happy and innocent life. Our second poem is a similar poem in some ways, A Little Boy Lost. There's many boy lost and girl lost poems, 6 in total. This one is a bit of an outsider, it doesn't fit with the others very much. And this is a child speaking the first 2 stanzas and raising, like Our Little Vagabond, a challenging view. He challenges the idea that it's possible to love more than anything other than yourself, really, and that self-love is the main kind of love, and that it's also impossible really to think of something greater than yourself, and so God isn't really imaginable. So it's a kind of philosophical debate about the essence of Christian belief, that we should care for others beyond ourselves, and that we should embrace and look up to this God figure who is bigger and grander than anything we can imagine. But how can we therefore relate to it, says the child. And then he offers this rather kind of functional, almost Cordelia-like view of love as duty. I love my father and my brother according to my bond, he might say. Again, little bird comes in as a comparison, but the little bird picks the crumbs around the door. In other words, the suggestion that I love because I get something from this person and therefore return their gifts with my affection. They feed me, therefore I'm, affectionate. That's not really what love seemed to mean according to most of our definitions of it. The rest of the poem, the dominant part of the poem, the 4 stanzas, and that's significant in that the child's voice is crushed and sort of limited and crushed in the first 2 stanzas, and then is sort of responded to with this incredibly harsh, ridiculously harsh, you might say, priest figure, trembling zeal, so this fierce, antagonistic view. All admired his priestly care is a ironic statement where people are watching and saying, oh yes, carry on mistreating this child, dragging him into church and abusing him, and this idea that people don't seem to object to that. And again, he calls him a fiend, a devil, and he thinks that he's setting up reason to judge his holy mysteries. The mysteries that Blake is talking about here is something that he objected to. He thought that the priests would use that word mystery as a way of kind of preventing people from asking awkward questions and saying, you don't really need to know this, I'll tell you what the truth is. And so Blake doesn't like the idea of a priest intervening between you and spiritual truth. You should be allowed to find your own spiritual truth. The child weeps. There's a lot of weeping in Blake's poems, but weeps in vain, and the parents are also weeping here. So the parents are upset, but they don't do anything to intervene. We get the iron chain, so very simple and direct images of control and authority. And then they burn him. In the final stanza, he's burnt. And are such things done on Albion, England's shore? No. In 1794, no. Such things were not being done. People weren't being burnt for heresy. But they had been in the past. And in fact, 200 years before, in the 1500s, that was going on. And although that seems a very long time ago to us, of course, it's actually the same distance or slightly briefer distance between Blake and Shakespeare's time, for instance, and us and Blake. We're more than 200 years after Blake ourselves. So I suppose it might have seemed a little bit more contemporary to him. Either way, he's using, I think, those images symbolically to say that historically there's been many kind of evils done in the name of religion, but there's still evils going on in the name of religion. If we're not actually burning people for heresy, we're certainly oppressing them and bullying them and mistreating them for daring to ask awkward questions. So here there does seem to be, if we look at our questions, no escape from constraints. Constraint wins the day. The parents themselves are not oppressive, but they seem to join in that oppression and allow it. Religion, definitely, as the third ever question set, was the religion is misery. Yes, this is what this poem's also about. So these 2, Little Vagabond and The Little Boy Lost, would have been your key poems for A Little Boy Lost. It's easy to mistake which one. Some are. A Little Boy Lost is this one, and A Little Boy Lost is definitely a religious poem. Human spirit has power to resist. To some extent, that resistance doesn't go very far and is quickly crushed. Again, if the boy is a marginalised figure, there's definitely no hope for him. He's outside of the kind of accepted view of things, and he's crushed underneath the power of the church, symbolically, if not actually. That maybe the actual imagery is excessive and absurd, but the truth behind it is a symbolic truth of the church will silence those who object. The church will force everyone to obey a certain way. Authority figures here are totally lacking kindness and compassion. And here, innocence definitely does not lead to joy. It leads to death, in fact, because you're innocently saying things that you don't quite realize are so objectionable, perhaps. And that is a very dangerous position to be in. Again, the poem's written in fairly clear rhyming structure, although the rhyme is not consistent and tends to be on lines 2 and 4. So no, more, door, hair, care, whereas the other pair don't rhyme. So there seems to be a lack of rhyme throughout mostly the poem on the first and third line in the stanza. He's just rhymed on 2 of the 4, which creates perhaps that sense of slight unease and slight off-balance quality to the poem, which of course the whole poem is about the lack of balance and sense and compassion and love that should be elements of a church's philosophy and approach. So these 2 poems, definitely key poems to know. Really use them to talk about, again, religion, definitely, but also what they really illustrate is that people's desire to oppress others, to control them, to force them to obey a certain limited and rigid set of beliefs and systems and approaches. And that can be spread out into any walk of life, not just religious. It's about education, it's about parenting, it's about governments with their people. And all of it is saying that authority figures often feel that their main purpose in life is to control the behaviour of those whom they have authority over. Whereas Blake is saying that shouldn't be the case. We should allow people to be free, to question, to follow their own instincts, to live a life of joy and delight as well. You know, that this is another thing that he's very much questioning throughout these poems, the idea of a sort of puritanical view of the world in which any kind of joy is intrinsically evil, is not how Blake sees things at all. So great pair of poems to use, to know well and to be able to turn quickly to in the exam.